right, welcome everyone. My name is Nicolas.
My name is John.
So today we are going to cover motion layout and the motion editor, and we'll try to give you like a nice overview of what's the thing that motion layout can do for you and what the support you have in order to deal with the tools. So first of all, what is motion layout? Well, essentially, if you want to create this kind of screen in your application, that's what motion layout is for. So it's a view group, nothing special there. It's actually a subclass of ConstraintLayout, which is nice because that means that all of the stuff that you learned about how to create a screen in ConstraintLayout, you can apply it directly when working with motion layout. So how does it do what it does, like the animation stuff? Essentially, we have to position those views. We are trying to animate those different views. And so we position them. And again, this is simply a subclass of ConstraintLayout, so you position them like if it was ConstraintLayout. Then, and that's one of the biggest differences, we've got this concept of states in motion layout. So the idea is that the specific type of animation we are interested in is animations that really go between different states. So you can define as many states as you want, but you go from state to state. The other thing that we do then is to animate between those states, and you will see through the talk there is a lot of possibilities there. And finally, we also provide to you a lot of nice ways to handle touch, so you don't have to encode handle the gestures. We do that for you. As I said, we essentially go with the bulk of the complexity, I guess, of motion layout, or the bulk of the power, is how do we transition between those states. And we have to start with essentially two states, at least, right? One starts state and an end state. We then can modify the way we transition by using keyframes, which are essentially just a point in time where you say, I want something to be at that particular value or that particular position. As I mentioned, we actually go much beyond just two states. You have multiple states. They can transition between each other in unrelated ways. So it can be a really powerful ways of expressing your animation. Let's quickly go on a little bit on how it's actually organized on Android. So we start with a layout file. As usual, again, it's a view group. And in the layout file, you're going to put all your normal views, set them up like normal with whatever attributes they need. Then that file actually points to a separate XML file called a motion scene that is in the XML directory. And that file will contain all the specification for your motion. And it contains specifically constraint set, which is essentially the different state that I mentioned, and the various transitions that you may have set up. So to kind of recap a little bit on that, think about it as you have your base state that's essentially the equivalent of your normal layout. And this is where you would build up the bulk of your screen, typically. And then you have the motion layout states where you can tweak and modify the different positionings, the different attributes, properties, and all of that. So constraint set, it's just a way to express the constraint. So if you know constraint layout, it's exactly the same thing. It's just that we moved it to this external file. But otherwise, it's very similar to what you know. We then have transitions. Transitions are nice because essentially we explicitly say, this is how you are going to move from that state to this second state. And you can actually indicate an on-click or an on-swipe handler just in XML, and so we can do that for you. So you can trivially associate, when I click on this thing, it will trigger this transition, or when I swipe the screen with my finger, that particular transition will be triggered. And the bulk on how the transition actually happens is done via keyframes in that keyframe set that is in the transition. And there is a lot of keyframes. We have keyframes for positioning, for changing specific attributes. How do you want to interpolate between attributes? We have key triggers that essentially are triggered, for example, when you hit a particular point in time, cycles that we'll cover a little later, etc. one thing important to keep in mind for the positioning is that we actually support multiple coordinate system. So what that means is that you would set up typically your states, essentially the terminal states, like those start and end states we talked about. You would set those up with ConstraintLayout. The normal constraint that you know of, you'll just apply them there. But the keyframes, it's a little different. We do not want to have essentially the complexity of the constraint system. We also did not think you need the entire capabilities of it at this point. But you do need something that is at the same time still a little flexible, that will correctly behave even if your device change, if it's change orientation, or simply to be able to adapt nicely to different device configuration, different screen size, etc. So one of the coordinate system we propose, and this kind of the default one, that's the simplest to think about, is just express it as it's a percentage in your parent, right? So at least even if the container changes the dimensions, the keyframes is still going to behave in a decent way. There's another one that's interesting, which is delta relative, which is, well, let's look at the start position and the end position, and essentially consider the difference between those two positions, and you express the keyframe positioning in that model. And then finally, there is a little more esoteric one, which do something similar, but in terms of the actual path being traveled. And that can, depending on what you want to do, that can be pretty useful. Another really nice feature is something we call cycles, which essentially allows you to add oscillation. And technically, you could build all of that with keyframe position. It's just that it would be a lot of work. And with cycles, you could just add with a few parameters, make things move in a very, very complex ways. We have a similar stuff that's called key time cycle, which does the same thing in time. Because if you keep, the thing is that right now, when you transition from the start to the end, and this is actually simply following a progress from 0 to 1. And it's, irregardless of how long is the transition, because in fact, you could have the transition being completely driven by a touch gesture. So the notion of time doesn't make a lot of sense in that particular model. Key time cycles allows you to essentially inject an oscillation in the same way as key cycle, but that's an oscillation that depends on the time. What that means in concrete terms is that if I'm moving with a key cycle, even let's say that I'm transitioning, I'm in between two states, and then I stop. Like, for example, that is driven by my gesture. Let's say that I do stop. Well, with key cycle, because we're in the middle of the progression, everything will stop, will freeze. But with key time cycle, because it's dependent on the clock, it will continue to animate. So that's another interesting things. So as you can tell, there's a lot of stuff very powerful with MotionLayout. And that's kind of the idea is we think that we have a system that is both very powerful. At the same time, if you want to use it in a simple ways, that is not complex at all. So let me show you a quick demo with the newly released Motion Editor. How would that work? First, you start with a constraint layout, basic screen like that, and you can simply go and convert it to MotionLayout. And that works in Android 4.0, Android Studio 4.0. Once you are converted, you end up with a MotionLayout. And the tool does a few things for you. We automatically create that secondary file, that motion scene. We convert the constraint layout to the motion layout, and you got this UI. If you look at the UI, we've got this panel here showing you the different states. Here we start with two states. We create two states to help you get on board. And I can simply go and manipulate the views in the editor, and my states will be impacted correctly. So now I got those two states. I can click on that transition arrow, and I'll see now I have the transition path that is being drawn, and I can directly see it in Studio. So you see, it's very straightforward. You can scrub your timeline. You can add new keyframes to modify how things change. So here I'm just changing a little bit the path. And you'll see that everything moves like that. If I add a click handler, because why not, I can simply say, okay, I'm going to, when I receive a click on that button, it's going to trigger that transition. So if I run it on device, by simply click on that, I have the transition. And zero code, very straightforward, a few minutes of work, and you got an animation. So one thing you may wonder is, okay, this is all great, but where do I use MotionLayout? Do I have to throw everything I did before and restart from scratch? Not quite. We do provide a lot of integration with existing components. It's relatively straightforward to integrate MotionLayout. The basic example is if you have a coordinator layout you have this typical toolbar that you may want to resize, and you may want to have some animation with that. And it's really, really easy. You just have to create a motion layout and hook up the progress of the coordinator layout to that motion layout. And we got this notion of having this progress as a base concept, and you can build up your animation entirely out of that. Similar things if you are using a drawer layout. You can go a lot more crazy than usual. View pager, similar principles. Another very powerful way that you can use MotionLayout with is if MotionLayout becomes essentially your coordinator among different views. So of course, we can do like basic animation where the equivalent of if you would do something with a vector animation or stuff like that, you could build that with MotionLayout. But the value of MotionLayout is when you're animating and coordinating various views in that way. So basic example, I've got this scene. It's a MotionLayout scene where things are moving around. And I've got this custom view. Sorry. I've got this custom view that draws this line in a fancy way. That custom view also simply picks up a progress value, and I can drive that directly from MotionLayout. Another way that you can take advantage of MotionLayout is, well, by nesting MotionLayout into another MotionLayout, right? So you could have very complex behavior. Here, I'm simply reproducing the coordinator-like behavior, but this is actually MotionLayout. And it's done simply with, you have an outer MotionLayout containing a second MotionLayout. So this is all great, but so far it's been like, okay, lots of XML, lots of GUI tooling, but can you do stuff by code? Well, of course you can. And in fact, that's actually one of the ways you can really benefit from MotionLayout, where you could keep a lot of the stuff that can be declared. You can keep it in the XML, but all the interesting logic, you put it in code. An example is how you can use MotionLayout and recycler view. And there's various ways of doing that. I've seen people on the internet doing crazy stuff. You could use MotionLayout as an item of recycler view, and et cetera, et cetera. There is one way I played a little bit with, where if I want to have this kind of screen with I have a recycler view on the bottom, and I'd like to have this kind of motion. And the idea is relatively simple, is that we describe that motion in a motion scene file, essentially using the MotionLayout architecture, but we describe that motion as if it was some kind of abstract stuff that you can apply to the recycler view. And the nice thing with that is that you split apart expressing your motion and how it should work, and how you plug it with the recycler view. So you got these things, and it's declared in your motion scene file, but it's declared in a relatively static way. That view is at a specific position in that file. So the way you can then adapt it to the real position while you are running a recycler view for that item is doing it programmatically. And it's not even very complex. You grab your constraint set that represents all the positioning rules for that state, clear up the couple of constraints that I had set in my file, basically ask the system for the actual position of the real object I want to move around, and reset those connections into the constraint set and reapply it. And that means that by doing that, I can just apply that animation to that. There's a little more magic going on there. I'm actually using a motion layout as a top element so that I can more easily build up this animation. But the gist of the idea is that. And by the way, those things are are going to be very soon in the GitHub if they are not already. But what's nice is that once you express your motion in this way, suddenly it becomes a lot more easier to maintain and to modify or change the type of animation you may want. So we start with this very basic one, but let me just add a key position, simply retarding the motion that's been presented. And suddenly you have a very different type of animation. Zero code, it's declarative, and that, I like that personally, much less bugs. And you can go and continue with having even more crazy stuff, like let's say that I'm adding rotation, and so you can build these things. And again, what I want to stress is that it's really easy to build. Once you set it up, going forward, it becomes super easy. In a similar manner, you can completely build the entire scene programmatically. So we have an example coming up very soon as an article, but here this is just essentially building up an histogram, building the different states of those views on the fly, and using MotionLayout to do the interpolation as you go. Another cute pattern is this MotionLayout list idea, where if you played with Recycler View, that should be relatively familiar. So let's say that you want a carousel pattern, something like that, and you want to move to the first view, but really you can go back and forth. You can actually represent that as MotionLayout states, where you have a start state, next state, previous. And the trick here is that when I'm actually getting a state change, I could just replace the different images, for example, of that carousel, and reset the progress of the animation. And by simply doing that, and updating the image, I can simulate essentially an infinite carousel. So essentially, we do that. We move, first transition, then we actually reset the progress. But while we do that, we replace the images, we re-update them. And altogether, what that means is that you got something that works like that. So it's not something new. This is the exact pattern that something like Recycler View uses. The advantage, of course, is, again, if you express it in this way, you have a lot of ways to then modify it. So here's a couple of examples that you could build. If I have this Recycler View things, I can just scroll it around. It's an infinite list. But again, it's the same scene, so I can really easily transition to something else. And I think there was another example. Yeah. Couple of other stuff, just another example, but again, similar idea. All right, I think that concludes the overall presentation of the library. John is going to take over for the motion editor.
So one of the things that's really cool that we put out in 4.0, it's still an alpha, so it has a lot of little bugs, is the motion editor. And you saw a quick demo of it, but let's kind of go through how it's all laid out. First, on the left, we have the attribute panel, not the attribute panel, the component tree and the palette. So if you want to drag items out, you've used this before in the past, so I'm sure you know what that's like. Then we have the main design surface, and you'll continue to use this, but the cool thing in motion editor is you can see animations in it. Then the overview panel, and this is actually a fairly critical piece of the system in that it's giving you a picture of the states and the transitions of the motion layout. So you can use it to see how many states you have, and you can get very complex number of states to do lots of complex things. But there's two parts to it. There's a little creation icons, and there's an overview graph. The creation icons have creating constraint sets, transitions, and gestures. And there are two gestures. So when you create, you just basically click on it, type in, and you see it adds the new state. And that's all you do to create a new state. It's there. You can create transitions, you select the start state, end state, and then you create transitions. And it's all drawn for you like that. So an on-swipe or on-click, those are the two gestures, and they're represented by a dot and a circle. We'll get back We'll come back to that. So we have the gestures, the dots and the dashes, the transition, the motion layout, which represents the original motion layout file. And sometimes you might want to go back to see what the original file looks like, this separate from your constraint sets.
But it's also like if you have specific attributes for your custom view or whatever that are set in that file, that's where you should edit them, essentially.
Yeah. And here we see the different items. Motion layout, a constraint sets, the transition, the click, the swipe, and there's a thing called derived constraints, and we'll see that a little later. One of the cool things about this system is we're trying to map the code as directly as possible so that when you look at what you see on the left, you can envision what the code is going to look like. In this particular case, you see we have two constraint sets, start and end, and we have one transition from start to end, and you're seeing it's all there. The little dot is the on-click. It has that on-click tag right there. And this can get very complex. In this case, you see a bunch of different constraint sets. Now, interestingly, the transitions as created top to bottom represent the lines going from top to bottom of the transition. And the constraint sets from left to right is top to bottom in the constraint sets. So you can kind of know where in your file that they correspond to. And if you rearrange them, it'll render them rearranged. And that's trying to give you a mapping so that it becomes very easy to know what your code looks like. So the overview graph is really to control the interaction with the scene. So if you click on anything, it'll show you that stuff. And if you click on it, it has some different behaviors when you click, and you're just going to have to use it. But there you see the transitions, the motion layout, the constraint sets. So that's the overview graph. Then the next panel is the selection panel. And that's where, when you select a particular constraint set or a transition, it'll show you the details of that layer. So it has three basic forms. It's either showing you a constraint set, a layout, or a transition. When it's in each form, when you've selected a motion layout, it just shows you what's the type of the object. It shows you the basic attributes of the object, whether it's constrained or not. That's kind of useful because you need to make sure objects are constrained in constraint layout and in motion layout. We could skip that. When you're in a constraint set, it's interesting that it has a constraint sets have check marks on the left to tell you in this constraint set, it has been constrained. If it's still getting its constraints from the motion layout, it will not show it checked. If it has a gray check, it means it's from a derived constraints. And derives allow you to have sort of nesting of constraint sets so that one constraint set is based on another. And here we see whether it's constrained, where it's constrained, and what's the component. Pretty straightforward. Again, it all maps back into a particular constraint set. And here you'll see when you select one of those, it maps it. So the transition panel allows you to show all of the different keyframes and key cycles and that kind of thing that you have created. It also has the scrubber that allow you to animate back and forth. And it has some controls. So it's an animation toolbar, keyframes, and there's a little creation at the top to allow you to create stuff. Any graphs that anytime you've created a cycle or attributes that are in a path, it'll show you as a graph to help you kind of visualize what's going on with them. Okay, so that's that. Now, attributes panel is actually changes a little bit. It's the same attribute panel that you've used before in the past, but it will change a little bit depending on what you've selected. It will reflect what's selected. So if you see you select a constraint set, you see it's showing you what's in the constraint set. If you select a transition, it'll show you the transition. So it's kind of allowing you to see the top level. But if you also click on a keyframe, it'll show you the keyframe. So basically, it's the same as every other attribute set we've done, attribute panel. When I click on object, you'll see what it does. What are the attributes associated with it? We have a little bit of a twist in that if it's grayed out, it means that it's coming from another constraint set or from the base layout. That way, if you see it grayed out, it means, oh, it's not actually defined in this current constraint set, but it is defined. So you can think of it as it's defined in a parent class. It's very much analogous to parent-child relationships in classes. So how do you create a constraint? Notice it's grayed out here, but once I change the value and hit enter, it's now bold, because what I did is copy them from wherever they were and made a copy into the constraint set. That allows you to quickly just go ahead and create constraint sets. The check mark will then get checked, and then once you make any of the manipulations on this graph, it will make them, and then you can continue to build them and add custom attributes, things like that. And in adding custom attributes, let's hope this shows. Okay. One of the things that's kind of neat is you can specify the type, and it will sort of give you, through introspection of that view, any of the methods that have that kind of type. So if you pick a color, then anything that implements an int, it will list for you. And so you can use it to introspect any of the types and manipulate any of them. Colors, floating point values, floats and colors are a little bit special in that now you have key attributes and you can have them interpolating those colors. And in this case, you see it interpolated a series of colors. Okay, so let's go through a demo. So I saw this about a month ago. A guy posted this on Twitter, and I thought it was a kind of a neat use because you see it has three states. It has a transition in the first state where it moves the thing across, and then a second transition where it goes like that. And so I decided I would try and build the equivalent of it, make me turn it up a little bit. So this is my version of it. Do I have to click?
Yep.
So I have a couple of different states, and now I have a bunch of things flying around like crazy because it's fun.
Because we miss Flash so much.
So let's look at a little bit of that inside of with the parts of the motion editor. And when I hit play, it's actually playing within the motion editor. But you saw that it shows you the cycles, it's showing you how it actually created those, and you see it's a complex set of translations in X and Y to produce these rotation effects. You can also show the paths, so you can see how all the paths are being animated by this. And one of the things that gives it that random-y feel is because all of them are staggered, and it's actually just a simple attribute on transition to say stagger all the behavior so that they don't all move at the same time. They sort of go one by one all over. So actually just do that one more time to kind of take you through it. The transitions, then there's a simple one, and then here you see it's a staggered one, next, and then it's looping back and forth.
I don't know if you noticed as well, but we actually auto-transition between multiple transitions there. So you could actually split it up in different sections and then set it up in a way that once that first section is done, we go to the next one.
Okay.
All right, that more or less wrap it up. And we should have a little time for questions. So if you want to check it out, what can you do? Well, first, you have to go on Android Studio 4.0. We released Canary 4. We're going to release Canary 5 very soon. It's still in active development, so bear with us if you encounter some bugs, and please file them. Right now, you have to use ConstraintLayout 2.0 Beta 3. Previous betas won't work with the motion editor. And we are probably going to have a beta for this week. The other thing to keep in mind is we actually did a lot of stuff in Android Studio 4, not just motion editor. And even just for the design tools, all those graphical tooling that we've been building, there is a lot more. So if you have not tried Android Studio 4, I highly encourage you to do so. If you have not played with stuff like the layout editor for some time, please do so. We made a lot of improvements and progresses this past year. Okay, and please file bugs. I promise you we do read those bugs and we go through them. And you can simply file them if it's something that happens in the library. If there's a problem on your device, file it in the ConstraintLayout component. If it's for the motion editor, in the motion editor components.
Yeah. Now is a really good time to file bugs on Motion Editor or MotionLayout, because we are trying to converge on a final releases of those two. So, some things, any little quirk you're seeing, let us know about it. Any sort of missing API, you think, oh, it should have had this particular, nothing grand, but like, oh, it's missing a simple API that would help with something, then let us know, real soon.
It would have to be very, very, very simple APIs.
Yeah.
Because we're actually thinking about ConstraintLayout 3. So,
yeah.
But anyway, as much feedback as you can give us, the better. Because that's really how we build that library is, by presenting it and getting a lot of interesting and useful feedback from developers. And at the end, that's really what we want to do, to build something useful for you. And to wrap it up, we actually have a workshop this afternoon at a little bit after 5 in Fisher East. If you do attend the workshop, try to get ready, because otherwise the network is not going to like that. Come with Canary 4 for Studio and Beta 3 for ConstraintLayout.
This will be, if you're interested, we're going to be there, and you can do whatever you want really in the workshop. We'll take you through some of the little demos and allow you to build something with the system. But if you also have any questions or problems with existing systems you're working on, just come and we'll talk.
Okay, and that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah.